I'm Avery Lockwood, 30 years old, an urban water systems engineer living in Denver. And the morning everything shifted began with a folded note pressed between 2 pages of my grandmother's old field journal. Its ink faint, but steady enough to read the line, warning me that if I'd found it, the people downstairs had already started moving against me, and I needed to get to Boise without telling anyone. I sat there with the spine of that journal digging into my palm while the echo of last night's laughter still clung to the walls. And the only thing I could hear was my own breath tightening as the sentence, "Don't trust what they read to you," made the room feel smaller than it was. I closed the journal, my thumb brushing the crease of the note, and whispered into the half-light that whatever they thought they'd locked in place at that table wasn't finished until I saw exactly what she meant. The house in Ogden carried the scent of roasted herbs and cold stone. And when I stepped into the hallway, I could still hear my father's voice from the night before, rolling through the banister with that clipped certainty, claiming Colin would be the one to handle everything because I'd never shown the instincts for leadership. I remembered how he lifted his glass while a cousin leaned in with a grin, asking if I even knew what a trust portfolio was. And the room shook with quiet approval when my father ended the moment with a remark about keeping responsibilities away from people who couldn't manage their own apartments. I had kept my face still through it. But in the dark afterward, the note in that journal felt like a hand pulling me out of the corner I'd been pushed into for years. I read the line again as the sun rose over the Wasatch Range, telling me to bring the note and nothing else. And the handwriting pulled a memory of her steady grip whenever she marked survey maps with red pencil. The words carried no comfort, only direction. And when I folded the page along its worn crease, I heard my own voice answer the empty room saying I knew exactly why she hadn't trusted anyone else with it. The same echo of last night's applause lingered behind the walls, but the evidence pressed between those weathered pages made it clear that whatever had humiliated me wasn't the end of anything, it was the beginning. The table in Ogden was already humming with low conversation when my father lifted his glass and framed the room in that measured tone, announcing that Colin would manage the family's holdings because, in his words, some responsibilities belong to people who can actually carry them. A cousin leaned back with a grin, asking whether I even understood what an estate ledger looked like. And when several relatives laughed into their napkins, the sound tightened across the silverware like a lid snapping shut. I kept my hands still under the table. But the moment my father turned toward me with a half-smile and the remark that it was better to keep complicated matters away from those who struggled with the basics, I felt the heat climb under my collar in a way silence couldn't soften. Colin reached for the carving fork with the kind of ease he saved for victories and nudged my elbow just enough to force a glance, murmuring that Denver must keep me too distracted to notice how real families handled legacy. He tapped his glass again so the room would hear the line about engineers being good with pipes but not portfolios. And the wave of quiet amusement that followed made the turkey steam feel heavier than it should. My mother kept her eyes fixed on the cranberry glaze, and when I asked if she'd known about any of these decisions, my father cut across the cloth with a clipped, "Don't start this here," that settled over the table like frost. Someone near the center asked whether I expected a sizable share, and before I could open my mouth, my father's voice carried over the plates, insisting that I should focus on my own life rather than chase things far beyond my grasp. Colin let out a soft laugh shaped into a question about whether I planned to contribute or simply collect, and the room leaned into it the way people lean into a familiar script. I folded my napkin slowly, hearing the scrape of chairs shifting away from me, and when I asked to see the documents being referenced, my father ended the moment with, "You don't need to worry about what isn't meant for you," and the applause that followed felt rehearsed enough to make the walls seem closer. I excused myself before dessert, walking past the rows of framed photographs lining the hallway, each one holding a version of this family that had never included me beyond the edges. The house settled into its evening warmth behind me, and when I reached the guest room, the echo of their laughter still followed me through the doorway, like a shadow I hadn't invited. I opened my suitcase to reach for a sweater and found an envelope wedged beneath the lining, its paper worn soft around the corners. And the moment I touched the seal, the noise from downstairs thinned into a distant hum I no longer felt the need to return to. The guest room felt colder when my phone buzzed with an incoming message from Colin's office account. And the moment I opened the attachment, I saw a half-finished petition stamped with the claim that I was unreachable and therefore removable as beneficiary. Its language sharp enough to make my chest tighten as I whispered into the quiet that someone had moved faster than they thought I would. A second draft sat beneath it, outlining a proposed transfer of control to him, and the line stating "no objection anticipated" made my fingers freeze around the screen because the timing matched the way he'd smirked at the dinner table. I scrolled through the metadata until the sender's initials appeared in the corner, and the evidence of his name sitting beside the upload date pulled the last thread holding my doubts together. I read through the petition again while the house settled into its late-night silence, and the wording struck me with the same weight as his remark in the dining room about real families handling legacy without complications. The claim that I'd failed to respond to multiple notices clashed with the unopened mailbox outside my apartment, and when I spoke into the darkness that they hadn't even bothered to mask the fabrication, the truth of that single line gave the room a hollow echo. I forwarded the file to a secure folder and watched the progress bar pulse like a warning I'd ignored for too long. The drive back to Denver started before dawn, and the mountains blurred past the windshield as messages from my mother appeared in fragments, each one urging me not to escalate anything because your father didn't mean harm and Colin is just trying to help. I let the words stack atop each other without responding, knowing the petition in my inbox contradicted every reassurance she offered. By the time the city lights came into view, the evidence sat fully downloaded on my laptop, and when I opened the document again in my apartment, the forged narrative staring back at me carried the same cadence as his voice calling me unprepared, leaving no question about what I had to do next. Robert Aldridge's office in Boise carried the kind of quiet that absorbs whatever you bring into it. And when he laid the original trust on the table, the crease down its center matched the fold in my grandmother's handwriting, tucked in my bag, as he remarked that she'd prepared this document 9 years earlier with instructions that no amendment could bypass the named beneficiary. I traced the embossed seal while he walked me through the clause, confirming an irrevocable structure, and pointed to the signature page, noting her cognitive evaluation. And the steadiness of those notations pressed against the memory of Colin's petition claiming I'd been unreachable. He opened a second folder containing the property records for the McCall house and the portfolio summary of the investment account. And the alignment between those records and the trust terms left no room for interpretation. He reviewed the fabricated petition next, adjusting his glasses as he highlighted the false statement, declaring they'd attempted to contact me multiple times. And the contrast between that claim and the blank notification log on my phone held its own weight in the room. The language requesting immediate reassignment of control mirrored the draft that had landed in my inbox the night before. And when he observed that this kind of misrepresentation carried consequences none of them were prepared for, the sharpness of that phrase pressed into my ribs with the same force the email timestamp had. He closed the folder gently, leaving the forged narrative sitting beside the authenticated pages, as if to show how easily a lie frayed under the pressure of documented truth. He asked whether I was ready for the fallout that would come once the trust was read aloud in its entirety, and the question lingered with the same cadence my father used at the table when he insisted I didn't understand what I was asking for. I lifted the note my grandmother had left me and read the line urging me to bring nothing but courage, and the familiar shape of her script steadied something in my chest that had been unmoored since Thanksgiving night. When Robert slid the certified copy across the table, the paper felt warmer than I expected, and as I tucked it into my bag beside her journal, I knew the evidence no longer belonged to the shadows where my family wanted it to stay. I returned to Utah before sunrise, and the house felt suspended in that uneasy stillness that settles before a storm. The same stillness that tightened when Colin stepped into the kitchen with a mug in his hand and remarked that he hoped I'd finally accepted how these decisions worked, because dragging things out only made everyone uncomfortable. He leaned against the counter with the same practiced ease he used at the Thanksgiving table and added that real leadership came from people who understood timing, not from those who disappeared into Denver whenever life demanded something difficult. I let the remark settle between us as I unlocked my phone, and the timestamp of his forged petition glowed on the screen with a clarity sharp enough to anchor the silence. My father arrived a moment later, carrying a stack of papers clipped into an unnecessary display of authority, and announced that the family would meet the next day to finalize the distribution plan. His tone shaped around the assumption that I knew better than to interfere. He glanced at my bag and asked whether coming back meant I was ready to sit in the audience instead of creating tension. The question delivered with the same restrained smile he'd used when he dismissed me from the conversation in front of our relatives. I told him the meeting would go smoother once every document was on the table, and the brief flicker in his expression matched the first time he realized someone had touched a truth he meant to bury. My mother found me in the hallway afterward, her hands twisting the edge of a dish towel, as she murmured that your father just wants harmony and don't push this further. The words carrying the same tremor I'd heard in her voice the night I left for Denver. She glanced toward the kitchen as if checking whether anyone else could hear her and urged me to let Colin handle things because it's easier for everyone. But the phrasing cracked against the memory of his smirk when he described legacy as something reserved for people who showed up. I walked past her with the trust packet secured inside my coat, and the weight of those authenticated pages pressed against my side like the only anchor I would need heading into what waited in Idaho. The lodge in McCall carried that brittle quiet that settles before a room is forced to pick a side. And the moment my father stood near the stone fireplace, arranging his stack of papers as if conducting a ceremony, he announced that today we finalize what this family has always known. The words rolling out with the same unshakable confidence he used whenever he believed the floor belonged only to him. A few relatives shifted in their seats while Colin stepped closer with a polished grin and added that everything had been prepared so smoothly that Avery won't have to worry about complicated responsibilities anymore. The phrasing landing with the same edge he'd used in the kitchen when he told me leadership wasn't for everyone. My mother lingered near the back with her hands knotted together, and when my father declared that Colin would manage the estate while I would receive a token $5,000 to honor fairness, the small ripple of polite applause pressed against my ribs like a familiar bruise. I let the sound fade before stepping fully into the room, and the turn of every head carried that faint irritation people reserve for the unexpected. Especially when my father's voice tightened as he remarked that the meeting had already begun and there's nothing here requiring your involvement. Colin folded his arms with a quiet smirk and added that this is why decisions belong to people who show up prepared. The remark echoing the language in his petition where he'd labeled me unreachable. I walked past the rows of chairs and placed my bag on the long table, and when I remarked that none of the documents he'd presented carried legal standing, the silence sharpened enough to make even the window glass seem to hold its breath. My father stepped closer with that familiar warning lodged under his tongue and asked whether I planned to disrupt the family's process again, the tone mirroring the night he insisted I didn't understand what I was asking for. I lifted the trust packet and remarked that the only disruption here was the stack of papers he'd written himself, the ones pretending to override an irrevocable structure, and the flicker in his eyes matched the first time he realized someone else was holding the truth he meant to bury. Colin moved toward me with a dismissive shake of his head and muttered that she found a piece of paper and thinks it changes anything. But the moment I placed the certified seal on the table, the room shifted the way floors shift before a storm breaks. The door opened behind us, and the sound of polished boots on hardwood cut through the tension as Robert Aldridge entered with the original trust tucked beneath his arm, his presence carrying the same steady weight as the embossed signature he carried. My father exhaled in a strained laugh and remarked that this entire display was unnecessary because the family has already agreed on a plan. But Robert unfolded the trust and let the pages settle flat as he read aloud the clause, naming me sole beneficiary, his voice crisp enough to slice through every rehearsed narrative in the room. My mother's breath caught at the confirmation date printed beside my grandmother's signature, and the evidence of her handwriting pulled a thin line of disbelief through the gathered relatives. Colin tried to interrupt with a declaration that she forfeited her rights by not responding to notices, but I opened my phone and displayed the blank notification log beside the petition bearing his initials in the metadata. The contrast as stark as the forged claim that I'd been impossible to reach. A cousin leaned forward with a confused frown as Robert pointed to the legal requirement that any amendment would need my documented participation. And the audible shift in the room felt like a tide turning against a shoreline that had been eroding for years. My father reached for the papers in front of him as if rearranging them could rewrite what had been read aloud. But the rigidity in his jaw betrayed the moment he realized the foundation he built had cracked in full view of every witness he'd invited. I placed the recording from the kitchen on the table, and the quiet playback of Colin's voice murmuring that real families handle legacy without complications collided directly with the petition's accusation that I'd been unavailable, the alignment so unmistakable that even he blinked at the sound of his own words. My mother stepped forward with her voice trembling as she said, "This isn't what your grandmother wanted." And the weight of that sentence settled into the room with the same gravity as the trust clause confirming intentional design. Several relatives leaned away from my father as if distance could soften the impact of the truth unfolding in front of them. But the thin veneer he relied on had already fractured beyond repair. My father finally broke the silence with a strained remark that "You're tearing this family apart." Yet the hollow echo of that line collided with the petition, accusing me of abandoning them. And the contradiction pulsed through the room with a clarity that left no space for sympathy. I gathered the authenticated documents and placed them beside the forged stack he had prepared, and the contrast between them felt like the final hinge snapping free after years of pressure. When I turned toward the window overlooking the frozen lake, the reflection staring back at me was no longer the daughter who swallowed humiliation at a dinner table, but the beneficiary my grandmother had trusted to carry what she built. Robert closed his folder with a measured nod, and the room remained still long enough for every witness to understand that the estate, the McCall house, and the investment portfolio were not slipping into Colin's hands, but returning to the path they were always meant to follow. My mother looked at me with a mixture of regret and recognition, and the slight nod she gave held more truth than any word spoken in this lodge. I gathered my bag, let the trust rest securely against my side, and walked out of the room as the last remnants of their fabricated narrative collapsed behind me like a structure built on borrowed breath. The drive back to the McCall house the next morning felt quieter than the lodge had ever been, and when I unlocked the front door, the air carried the faint scent of pine my grandmother used to bring inside during winter. The familiarity settling just enough to steady my pulse as I whispered that the place finally felt like it belonged to someone who could breathe inside it. I walked through the rooms with the trust packet held against my side, and each doorway reminded me of the moment Robert read her signature aloud, the cadence still resting in my chest, like proof that the chaos in that lodge hadn't been strong enough to bend what she built. By the time I stepped onto the back deck, the stillness of the lake pressed close enough that I could hear my own breath, and the weight of every document tucked into my bag eased in a way I hadn't felt since Denver. I spent the weekend clearing the narrow garden bed she once planted with mountain herbs, and while scraping away old roots, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother asking if you're safe up there, and I hope you know I never wanted it to go that way. The tremor in her words carrying the same fragile honesty she'd tried to hide behind a dish towel in the hallway. I knelt beside the soil long enough to read the message twice, feeling the weight of her apology press against the memory of her standing motionless while my father announced a future that didn't include me. I answered only with, "I'm all right," letting the truth of those two words settle in the quiet air above the garden bed. Late that afternoon, I opened my grandmother's journal on the porch and traced the crease where she'd tucked the note that set everything in motion. The ink still sharp enough to mirror the line Robert had read about intentional design. The hum of the lake drifted through the trees as I murmured that I finally understood why she placed her trust where she did. Not as a reward, but as a direction meant for someone who could dismantle the lies without becoming part of them. I closed the journal slowly, feeling the steadiness of that paper linger against my palms as the sun slid behind the ridge, and the house stood quietly behind me, no longer a secret to fight over, but a place where I could start again. Thank you for staying with me through every turn of this story. And as I stand in the quiet of this house, I carry a kind of calm I once thought was out of reach. If any part of my journey echoed something in your own life, I hope you'll stay close for the next chapter I share. Your time here matters more than you know, and I'm grateful you spent it with me.